All right, so we're in Genesis 42 and following. I guess we'll be reading for a while. Hopefully, you found it by now. Here goes. When Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why are you standing here looking at each other?" He also said, "Listen, I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us, so that we may live and not die." So 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt. But Jacob did not send Joseph's brother Benjamin along with his other brothers because he said something bad might happen to him. The sons of Israel were among those who came to buy grain because of the famine in the land of Canaan. Joseph was the governor over the land. He was the one who sold grain to all the peoples of the land. Joseph's brothers came and bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them, but he acted like a stranger toward them and spoke harshly to them. He asked them, "Where did you come from?" They said, "From the land of Canaan to buy food." Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him. Joseph remembered the dreams he had dreamed about them and said, "You are spies. You have come to see where the land is exposed." They said to him, "No, my lord, your servants have come to buy food. We are all one man's sons. We are honest men. Your servants are not spies." He said to them, "No, you have come to see where the land is exposed." And as we keep reading here, I want you to keep track of the times when they slip up and they start telling a little white lie, or they about what happened to Joseph, or about their family, or they start just talking about things that they have come to believe after 17 years of being apart from their brother. Okay, we'll see some of those here shortly. Verse 12, he said to them, "No, you have come to see where the land is exposed." They said, "We, your servants, are 12 brothers, the son of one man in the land of Canaan. Listen, at the present time, the youngest remains with our father, and one is no more." Joseph said to them, "It is just as I said, you are spies. This is how you will be tested. By the life of Pharaoh, you shall never get out of here unless your youngest brother comes here." So verse 15, you might recall that Pharaoh was considered a god, and that he ended up. We talked about this last time a little bit. He would delegate all the governing responsibilities to somebody else, and then he would basically spend his life showing up and being worshipped at places and preparing for his afterlife. So when he says in verse 15, "By the life of Pharaoh," he's putting himself under oath, or putting them under oath, saying that he is very, very serious about this. So by the life of Pharaoh, you shall never get out of here unless your youngest brother comes here. Send one of you to get your brother. The rest of you will be kept under arrest, so that your words may be tested, whether you are telling the truth. Otherwise, by the life of Pharaoh, you are spies. He kept them all together confined in the jail for 3 days. 3 days isn't so bad compared to what, 7 years? On the third day, Joseph said to them, "Do what I tell you, and you will live, because I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers be confined in the jail, but the rest of you go and deliver grain to your houses to relieve the famine. Bring your youngest brother to me so that your words may be verified, and you will not die." So they did as he said. They said to one another, "We are certainly guilty concerning our brother, because we saw the misery of his soul when he begged us, but we would not listen. That is why this misery has come upon us." Reuben answered them, "Didn't I tell you, do not sin against the boy? But you would not listen. So now payment for his blood is being required from us." They did not know that Joseph understood them, because an interpreter was being used between them. Joseph turned away from them and wept. After he returned and spoke to them, he seized Simeon from among them and tied him up before their very eyes. Then Joseph gave a command to fill their containers with grain, to return each man's money into his sack, and to give them food for the journey. So all this was done for them. They loaded their donkeys with their grain and departed from there. When one of them opened his sack at the lodging place to give his donkey food, he saw his money. It was right there in the mouth of his bag. He said to his brothers, "My money has been returned. Look, there it is in my bag." Their hearts sank, and they turned to one another, trembling. "What is this that God has done to us?" They came to Jacob their father in the land of Canaan and told him everything that had happened to them. They said, "The man, the lord of the land, spoke harshly to us and accused us of being spies against the country. We said to him, 'We are honest men, we are not spies. We are 12 brothers, sons of our father. One brother is no more, and at the present time the youngest is with our father in the land of Canaan.' That man, the lord of the land, said to us, 'This is how I will know that you are honest men. Leave one of your brothers with me. Take grain to relieve the famine at your houses, and go on your way. Bring your youngest brother with to me. Then I will know that you are not spies, but that you are honest men. Then I will release your brother to you, and you will be allowed to conduct business in the land. Their sacks, they were surprised to see that each man's pouch of money was in his sack. When they and their father saw their pouch of money, they were afraid. Jacob, their father, said to them, You have deprived me of my children. Joseph is no more, Simeon is no more, and now you want to take Benjamin away. All these things are against me. Reuben spoke to his father, You may put my two sons to death if I do not bring him back to you. Entrust him to my care, and I will bring him back to you again. Jacob said, My son will not go down with you, since his brother is dead, and he alone is left. If he has a mishap on the journey you are taking, he will bring my gray hairs down to the grave with sorrow. The famine in the land was severe, so when they had eaten all the grain that they had brought from Egypt, their father said to them, Go back and buy a little more food for us. Judah said to him, The man sternly warned us, You shall not see my face unless your brother is with you. If you send our brother with us, we will go down and buy food for you. But if you do not send him, we will not go down, because the man said to us, You shall not see my face unless your brother is with you. Israel said, Why do you treat me so badly by telling the man that you had another brother? They said, The man interrogated us about ourselves and about our relatives. He asked, Is your father still alive? Do you have another brother? We just answered his questions. Is there any way we could have known that he would say, Bring your brother down here? Judah said to his father Israel, Send the boy with me, and we will get up and go, so that we may live and not die, both we and you, and also our little ones. I will serve as a guarantee for him. You can hold me accountable for him. If I do not bring him back to you and set him in front of you, then let me bear the blame forever. Look, if we had not delayed, we certainly could have returned for a second time by now. Their father Israel said to them, If it must be so, then this is what you should do. Put some of the best products of the land into your containers and take a gift for the man. A little balm, a little honey, spices and myrrh, pistachios and almonds. Also take double the amount of silver with you. Take back the silver that was returned into the mouths of your bags. Perhaps it was an oversight. Also take your brother. Get going and return to the man. May God Almighty grant you mercy before the man, so that he will release your other brother and Benjamin to you. But if I am deprived of my children, I am deprived. The men took that present, and they took double the amount of silver with them. They also took Benjamin. They got up, went down to Egypt, and stood before Joseph. When Joseph saw Benjamin with them, he said to the manager of his house, Bring the men into the house. Butcher an animal and prepare it, for the men will dine with me at noon. The manager did as Joseph commanded and brought the men to Joseph's house. The brothers were afraid because they were brought to Joseph's house. They said, Because of the money that was returned into our bags the first time, we are being brought in, so that he may find a pretext against us, pounce on us, seize us as slaves, and take our donkeys. They approached the manager of Joseph's house and spoke to him at the door of the house. They said, Please, my lord, we really did come down the first time to buy food. When we came to the lodging place, we opened our bags, and to our surprise, each man's silver was in the mouth of his bag, the full amount of our money. We have brought it back with us. We have also brought down with us additional money to buy food. We do not know who put our money into our bags. He said, There is no problem. Do not be afraid. Your God, the God of your father, has given you treasure in your bags. I received your money. He brought Simeon out to them. The man brought the men into Joseph's house and gave them water so they could wash their feet. He gave their donkeys fodder. They prepared the gift for Joseph, who was coming at noon, because they heard that they would be eating bread there. When Joseph came home, they presented him with the gift that they had brought to the house, and they bowed down to the ground in front of him. He asked them about their welfare. Is your father well, the old man of whom you spoke? Is he still alive? They said, Your servant, our father, is well. He is alive. They bowed down and prostrated themselves. Joseph looked up and saw Benjamin, his brother, his mother's son, and he asked, Is this your youngest brother, the one you told me about? He said, God be gracious to you, my son. Joseph hurried out because he was overcome by his emotions over his brother, and he looked for a place to weep. He went into his room and wept there. Then he washed his face and came out. After he regained control of himself, he said, Serve the meal. They served Joseph by himself, the brothers by themselves, and the Egyptians who ate with him by themselves, because the Egyptians do not eat with Hebrews, for that is repulsive to the Egyptians. The brothers were seated in front of him. They were lined up in order, starting with the firstborn based on his birthright, down to the youngest based on his youth, and the men expressed their amazement to each other. He sent servings to them from his table, but Benjamin's portion was 5 times as much as any of theirs. They were drinking and they were feeling the effects. We'll pause there. There's one more chapter in this section that is another 30 or 40, 34 verses. First of all, any questions on what we read in chapters 42 and 43? None. Okay. We're going to give you just a couple minutes with those seated at your table or the people that you came with, whichever it happens to be. And we've got just one question, and this would be mostly back in, earlier in 42. Back in chapter 42, when the brothers have discovered their money, and then Genesis 42 verse 28, and then again in 42 verse 36. And the question is, how do you understand these men trying to figure out if God is for them or against them? They've got this money returned to them, and both times these people came out and said, well, God must be against us or God must be for us. And the question is, what do you think of that? I'll just leave it open like that. If you look especially at Genesis chapter 42 verse 28 and 36, how do you analyze? What do you think of what these guys are saying? All right. I think that's the wording we'll use. How do you as a Christian analyze their words especially in verse 28 and in 36? And you can definitely understand that, there's a lot going on and their heads are spinning. But they get to the place of, well, I'll stop talking now. With the people seated nearby at your table, give you a minute or two on that. All right. Hopefully I gave us a minute to look at that a little bit more closely. How do you, as a Christian, how do you analyze their words and their reactions to their circumstances? Either what's going on, or are they correct, or are they totally off base? What do you think? Where should we start? AJ usually knows. Yeah. Yeah. So, one of the questions is, why would they be in trouble? That, and I think where you kind of come around to is that whoever is selling them the grain is keeping a tally of this. And if this famine is going to keep going on for a while, then they wouldn't be seen as spies, but as thieves, which is almost as bad. And they're like, oh no, if we have our money, then we didn't actually pay. And maybe they're trying to trick us, or maybe we will get in really bad trouble, but that's the only place to get food. So there's maybe a little bit of that going on. Elka. Yeah. So here's the circumstance. And in chapter 43, we hear when they do go back, the manager of the house is like, we got your money. I don't know what you're talking about. And he intended it. I mean, Joseph probably intended it as a test of some sort. to see what his brothers are like, because he does a few of those during the course of these chapters, to see if his brothers have actually changed or not. And in chapter 43, we hear that the manager of the house says, well, we already received your payment and you paid last time, so don't worry about it. But when they see it, their conscience is speaking up again, that they don't know what's going on. And so they think, well, I must be getting payback of some sort for what I did to our brother. This is still top of their mind, and it's been almost 20 years. Yeah. 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 It's almost like they're trapped. Well, if you're being honest about it, then you'll come back. And then, well, I did come back, and you'd be trapped. Anything else? And I think, and then the words of Jacob there in verse 36. Jacob, Jacob, their father said to them, "You have deprived me of my children. Now you want to take Benjamin, and all these things are against me." You could tell that Jacob has, I mean, his life had certainly taken a turn for the worse when Joseph disappeared. And I mean, it had taken a turn for the worse a long time before that. But he's just saying, this whole everything is falling apart. And he assigns, God's favor based on what he sees with his eyes. And I think that's the other thing that we saw from verse 28, that they try to determine what God thinks of them on the basis of what happened to them, rather than on the basis of what they know from God speaking to them, or from what God's word had said.
So Joseph in slavery, or saying that he's dead.
Yeah.
He loved Joseph. He gave him the coat.
Uh-huh.
That's why they sold him.
Yep. I wish we had a little bit more detail about that in especially in chapter 50. Because all this time they've been saying, here's this coat, we covered it in blood, but draw your conclusion for yourself. And he's been thinking for nearly 2 decades that his son is dead. And then afterward, when he finds out that Joseph is alive, maybe he's just so overjoyed that he doesn't stop to think, wait a second, my 11 sons kept up this lie for almost 20 years. That would be a kind of a difficult thing to think through. But I think he did forgive them. And when we look at, I think we skip over Jacob blessing his sons. But Jacob certainly can see that is the same thing that we saw with like Cain and Abel, that Adam and Eve and their sin meant that Cain and Abel were both sinful. And even though Eve was hoping that Cain would be the promised Messiah, the champion, it turned out he wasn't. He was just as sinful as Adam was. And we see that same trend of the sin that the parent did is often the sin that the children did. And here was Jacob, who had tricked his brother and his dad numerous times, and then his sons trick him. And all together, all one big trick, but they keep it up for a long time. And at some point you just throw up your hands and say, Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. because these children of mine, all 12 of them, or 13 if you include their sister Dinah, all 13 of them are exactly in Jacob's image, even to the point of indulging in the exact sin that Jacob was guilty of trickery and deception. And I guess that's about where I end up. I don't have 12 children, and most of them aren't old enough to play a mean trick on dad, at least not yet. But that would take a lot of faith, I would think, or that would take a lot of conversation to think it through and say, yeah, I do forgive you, and I'm glad that Joseph is still alive. Anything else? Yeah. 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 Yep. Yeah. Yeah, the last time that Jacob had seen Joseph, he said, "Go see your brothers. They're over there." And then Joseph is like, "Oh, they're actually over here." And Joseph never came back. And yeah, just the trauma of that day. All right. Anything else on that? Then, if not, sorry, I'm looking the wrong way. All right. We will pick up with our last chapter, chapter 44. After we thought our way into that a little bit and some of the circumstances, chapter 44 concludes this episode. Reads like this: Joseph commanded the manager of his house, fill the men's bags with food as much as they can carry. Put each man's money into the mouth of his bag. Put my cup, the silver cup, into the mouth of the bag of the youngest, along with his money for the grain. The manager did exactly what Joseph told him to do. As soon as it became light in the morning, the men were sent on their way with their donkeys. When they had left the city and still were not very far away, Joseph said to his manager, "Get up, pursue those men. When you overtake them, ask them, 'Why have you repaid evil for good? Isn't this the cup that my Lord drinks from and that he uses for divination? By doing this, you have done evil.'" So in verse 5 there, when he says divination, what he's talking about is like sorcery or trying to get an answer from spirits that are not God. Okay. Verse 6, the steward caught up to them and spoke these words to them. They replied to him, "Why does my Lord say such things? Your servants would never do such a thing. That money which we found in the mouths of our bags, we brought it back to you from the land of Canaan. Why then would we steal silver or gold out of your Lord's house? If your cup is found with any of your servants, let him die, and we also will be my Lord's slaves." You're almost reminded there of what Jesus says about let your yes be yes and your no be no. Like, don't speak too rashly here, because time out, it gets worse. Verse 10, he said, "Fine, it will be just as you have said. If it is found with anybody, he will be my slave, and the rest of you will be blameless." Then each man quickly lowered his bag to the ground, and each man opened his bag. The manager searched, beginning with the oldest and finishing with the youngest, and the cup was found in Benjamin's bag. Then they tore their clothing, and each man loaded his donkey and returned to the city. When Judah and his brothers came to Joseph's house, he was still there. They fell to the ground before him. It's kind of interesting there when he says Judah and his brothers, because Judah had been the one, I think, when they left this last time in chapter 43, Judah had been the one to finally say that I'm going to guarantee Benjamin's safety. And Jacob finally took him up on that. So Judah is highlighted as the important one here in verse 14. Joseph said to them, "What did you think you were doing? Didn't you know that a man like me can discover things by divination?" Judah said, "What can we tell, my lord? What can we say? How can we clear ourselves? God has exposed the guilt of your servant. Here we are. We are my lord's slaves, both we and the one in whose hand the cup was found." Joseph said, "I would never do that. The man in whose hand the cup was found will be my slave. But as for the rest of you, go up in peace to your father." Then Judah approached him and said, "O Lord, please let your servant speak directly to my Lord. Do not let your anger burn against your servant, because you are just like Pharaoh. My Lord asked his servants, 'Do you have a father or a brother?' We said to my Lord, 'We have a father, an old man, and a child from his age, a young one. His brother is dead, and he alone is left from his mother, and his father loves him.' You said to your servants, 'Bring him down to me so that I may see him with my own eyes.' We said to my Lord, 'The boy cannot leave his father, for if he were to leave his father would die.' You said to your servants, 'Unless your youngest brother comes down with you, you will never see my face again.' And so it was that when we came to your servant, my father, we told him about the words of my Lord. Our father said, 'Go down again, buy us a little food.' We said, 'We cannot go down. If our youngest brother is with us, we will go down, because we cannot see the man's face unless our youngest brother is with us.' Your servant, my father, said to us, 'You know that my wife gave birth to 2 sons for me. The one has departed from me, and I said, I am sure he is torn to pieces, and I have not seen him since. If you take this one away from me as well, and mishap comes upon him, you will bring my gray hairs down to the grave with sorrow. So now, when I come to your servant my father, and the boy is not with us, since my father's life is bound up in the boy's life, when he sees that the boy is no more, he will die. Your servants will bring down the gray hairs of your servant our father to the grave with sorrow. For your servant became a guarantee for the boy to my father. I said, if I do not bring him to you, then I will bear the blame before my father forever. So please let your servant stay as a slave to my lord instead of the boy, and let the boy go up with his brothers. For how can I go up to my father if the boy is not with me? How could I stand to see the evil that will come upon my father? All right, that takes us through chapter 44. Any questions? So far, so good. So in your book, at the very top, this is around 1884 to 1859 BC. The famine that God had foretold through Joseph as an interpretation of Pharaoh's dreams didn't just affect Egypt. The entire region was besieged by a severe lack of food. Because of God's gracious planning through Joseph, there was enough food stored in Egypt during the good years to keep everyone in the region reasonably well fed. Everyone came to Joseph to get food. And then the two summary points underneath where it says Genesis 42, 43, 44. Bullet point number 1, because they were running low on food, Jacob sent his remaining sons to Egypt to buy grain from the Egyptian surplus. And Joseph used his position of authority to test his brothers to see if their hearts had changed. All right, number 1. When Jacob's other sons went to Egypt, Joseph recognized them immediately, but they didn't recognize him. Why do you think they didn't recognize their own brother? Give me a minute if you need it. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, he has a very different appearance just in that the Egyptians, would be clean shaven, and the Hebrew people generally were not, and that for a number of years at least, Joseph has been living as the top guy in Egypt, at least after Pharaoh, and so he's been living a pretty plush life and maintaining his appearance that way. Plus, he has an Egyptian wife and children that they didn't see yet, but he's been living as an Egyptian for a long time. Anything else? Yeah. Yeah. And you know how, people change um, over time. Yeah. Yeah. He's grown up. He had the last time they had seen him, he was like 17 years old, and now he's 30. I used to be able to say he's almost as old as me. And anyway, number 1. He was older, and maybe the term you could use there is regal, which is like kingly. They figured that he was dead. And another detail here, that he used an interpreter, that even though he knew the Hebrew language, he was speaking Egyptian to this interpreter, who would then interpret to the brothers, translate from Hebrew to, or from Egyptian to Hebrew, and then in reverse. So he would listen in, but he kept up this ruse, pretending, concealing his identity. Yeah, I think that could definitely play a part in it. That God worked through the natural realities of 15 years, 17 years of time have passed. Plus, he lives in a very different place, and then God made sure to keep Joseph's identity hidden for a little while. I think that's entirely plausible. What about number 2? And you can summarize it however you would like. I'm not too picky on that. Number 2, Joseph was pretty harsh with his brothers, and this was across 3 chapters, 42, 43, 44. What are some of the ways in which Joseph was harsh toward his brothers? What is one? AJ. Yeah. So he returns their payment, and they're terrified, and they take it as this bad sign that happened to them. Like, uh-oh, we are going to be in super big trouble now. What else, Jim? All right, yeah, a little bit of fear, and that event still plays on their conscience because they're feeling very guilty for what they had done to Joseph. And I guess they did know that the Ishmaelites were traveling through on their way down to Egypt. So And they just figured Joseph would probably end up there. Yeah. All right. Joseph threw his brothers in jail, not for, 5 or 10 years, but 3 days is certainly long enough where they have to eat jail food and hopefully, get a jail shower. Do we have any there? Oh yeah. And he called them spies numerous times. You've come here to spy out the land. No, we haven't. Whoops, now we've got our money back in our bags. Yeah. Yeah, that's that last part that he sent his steward after them and said, why have you stolen from my lord? From from Joseph. They're like, no, I haven't. Well, yeah, you have. What about number 3? Question of why? Why do you think he did this? Give you a second to think about that. I'm going to double check that the heat is on. Yeah, why do you think Joseph treated his brothers like this? Yeah. And Joseph's like, hey, now I'm the one in charge. And now it's my turn to get back at you. Jim. Mm-hmm. All right. So it's not so much a personal thing, but I want them to see a little bit of what I've been through so that they change their ways. Any others? I think another aspect of it is that he's trying to see if they really have changed because he's got a pretty good life now in Egypt and he has a family there and it's set up. Um, he's got a good job, a good position, and he's going to be set for life. Um, and he doesn't have to reconcile with his family. Like he can just go on living his life and take your food, go on home, and sayonara. But he wants to see have they really changed over the last period of time, or are they just still the same old hateful brothers that can only think about themselves? Hmm. Yeah, a couple of times. Joseph has to excuse himself and go out of the room and weep quietly in his room, even when he sees his brother for the first time. And I mean, he does love his brother and his father. Um, as far as his relationship with his other brothers, I don't know, but it's good enough that he's gonna at least see how things have changed over the last few years. How about number 4? Joseph was harsh. We also see that there were a few times that Joseph was gentle or even loving with them. What are some ways that he was kind to them? Yeah. All right. Come over to my house. And it's not just cheese and crackers or peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, which are fantastic. But he's got like this incredible feast that he just lays out for them. Any others? I think that's the biggest one. And then also the ones that are listed for you here, that he gave them their money back and he marked it down that they had received their money. And so Joseph knows that the family is going to has to get through the next 7 years of famine, and buying food for 7 years um, might be a bit of a hardship for that family. And then he also provided food for them and for their donkeys on the way back. Jimmy's like, I don't have to answer that. Provisions. You could just say he gave them food for the journey. So they didn't have to stop at McDonald's on the way back. Yeah. Yeah, we'll get to that here in a little bit too. That Benjamin got 5 times as much as the others. Number 5, why else? Well, I think the fact that Joseph went above and beyond, even when he didn't have to, shows us a little bit about where Joseph, that he still loves them and that he has forgiven them. And I mean that kind of comes into play also when we talk about the topic of forgiveness, that it is possible to forgive somebody even if they haven't asked for forgiveness or they will hold a grudge against you, but you don't have to hold a grudge against them. Number 6, this one's a good one. Judah was the brother who had originally suggested that they sell Joseph into slavery. I was back in Genesis chapter 37. How could Joseph tell that Judah's heart had changed? That's especially in chapter 44, when Judah is the one who speaks up. And then he appoints himself spokesman for all the brothers. How do we see in 44, especially that last half of that chapter, the conversation between Judah and Joseph? How do we see that that Judah has changed? What gives us a little bit of a hint? Yeah, that's the biggest one. Verse 33. So please let your servant stay as a slave to my Lord instead of the boy. So he's saying, please let Judah stay as a slave for Joseph instead of Benjamin staying, and let Joseph or let Benjamin go home with the brothers. That's the biggest thing. And even though, and I think that's probably even more precise than the one we have on the screen about defending his younger brother. That Judah has taken on the responsibility for this younger brother, and he's willing to bear the hardship rather than having that youngest brother be the one who is enslaved and imprisoned. It's like a 180-degree shift from where it had been, where Judah had said, let's sell him into slavery. And now Judah's like, don't take him as a slave, take me instead. Yeah. Oh, don't do that. It's like flinching. Catches my eye. Number 7. I guess this is helpful. Maybe not. You can cross number 7 out. We'll skip that one. Because that goes back. Yeah, I'm serious. That goes back to that question we had back when we talked about Abraham sacrificing his son Isaac, and what pictures do you see of Jesus in the Old Testament? And while it's true that Jesus came from Judah's family line, what Judah is really doing is demonstrating a proper repentant heart, and offering. Yes, he is offering to be a slave in place of his brother, but in Judah's case, it's simply a matter of repentance. It's not a matter of the completely innocent party, which is Jesus, stepping in for the slave, stepping in for the person and taking their punishment, which is what Jesus did for you and for me. So I think, well, it might be an interesting point to say, well, Jesus came from Judah's family line, and that's interesting as far as it goes, but it's not really helpful. So we'll pick it up with Genesis chapter 45 and 46. Wow. the episode comes to its conclusion. Yes. Yeah, because that's the thing. Like my standard is this a picture of Jesus or not? Is there a New Testament passage that talks about this as a picture of Jesus? And so we have New Testament. Jesus says that just as Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days, so the Son of Man will be in the belly of the earth. Um, because if the standard is something other than that, then it's very easy to start looking, especially at the numbers and all the details that you have in the Old Testament, and say that, well, that must be the case. I think the significance of 3 days is kind of even the same thing for today. That there are people who might get picked up by the police and then they sit in jail overnight, for their well-being or whatever the case may be. But they get out the next morning and they can go get a burger at a restaurant where they want and go home and have a shower. If you're there for 3 days, then you have to eat the prison food, you have to interact with the prison staff, you have to use the prison facilities, as good or not good as they are. And I think just the significance of 3 days was it was long enough for them to say, "Oh, this is very unpleasant, and I would rather not be here, and I hope things change." Okay. Hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of cool details like that, and it does happen quite often, like that number three kind of shows up in Scripture. Um, but I don't think it has a whole lot of added significance aside from the times when we hear about added significance of that. Any other questions? All right. That picks us up with chapter 45. We have 34 more verses through the end of this section. Joseph was unable to control himself in front of all his attendants, so he called out, "Send everyone out of my presence." When no one else was left with him, Joseph revealed himself to his brothers. He wept out loud. The Egyptians heard him, and the house of Pharaoh heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" His brothers could not answer him because they were terrified by his presence. Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me, please." They came closer. He said, "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. Now do not be upset or angry with yourselves for selling me to this place, since God sent me ahead of you to preserve life. For 2 years now, the famine has been in the land, and there are still 5 more years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. God sent me ahead of you to preserve you as survivors on the earth, and to keep you alive by a great act of deliverance. So it was not you who sent me here, but God, and he has made me a father to Pharaoh, lord over his entire household, and ruler over the whole land of Egypt. Hurry, go up to my father and tell him, this is what your son Joseph says. God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not delay. You shall live in the land of Goshen, where you will be close to me, you, your children, your grandchildren, your flocks, your herds, and all that you have. I will take care of you here, for there are still 5 years of famine. Otherwise, you will come to ruin, you and your household and all that you have. Pay attention. Your eyes and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see that it is my mouth that speaks to you. You shall tell my father all about my position of honor in Egypt and about everything that you have seen. Hurry and bring my father down here." He threw his arms around his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, and Benjamin wept on his shoulder. He kissed all his brothers and wept over them. After that, his brothers talked with him. This report was heard in Pharaoh's house. "Joseph's brothers have come." This pleased Pharaoh and his officials. Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Tell your brothers, load your animals, travel quickly to the land of Canaan, get your father and your households, and return to me, and I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you will eat the rich food of the land. Now I command you to do this. Take carts from the land of Egypt for your little ones and your wives, and bring your father here. Also, do not worry about your belongings, for the best of the whole land of Egypt is yours." So that is what the sons of Israel did. Joseph gave them carts as Pharaoh had commanded, and he gave them supplies for the journey. He gave each one of them a change of clothing, but to Benjamin he gave 300 pieces of silver and 5 changes of clothing. He sent the following to his father: donkeys loaded with the best things of Egypt, and 10 female donkeys loaded with grain and bread and supplies for his father on the journey. So he dismissed his brothers, and they departed. He said to them, "See to it that you do not quarrel on the way." They went up from Egypt and came to Jacob, their father, in the land of Canaan. They told him, "Joseph is still alive, and he is ruler over all the land of Egypt." Jacob was stunned because he did not believe them. They told Jacob every word that Joseph had said to them. When he saw the carts that Joseph had sent to carry him, the spirit of their father Jacob revived. Israel said, "It is enough. Joseph, my son, is still alive. I will go and see him before I die." Israel traveled with all that he had until he came to Beersheba, where he offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. Beersheba is like the most southern part of the land of Canaan, like down by the bottom part of the Dead Sea. So he came to the bottom border before going out of his country, is what we're saying there. Verse 2, God called to Israel in a vision at night, "Jacob, Jacob." Jacob said, "I am here." He said, "I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for there I will make you into a great nation. I will go down to Egypt with you, and I will certainly bring you back again, and Joseph's hand will close your eyes." All right. Any questions? What about verse 24? Joseph gives them all this stuff, and Pharaoh hears about it, and Pharaoh's like, "Just tell him to come live with us for a while." And Joseph's like, "Bye, have a good journey. We'll see you soon, and don't quarrel with each other." Why do you think Joseph says that? Yeah, they're quarrel like brothers. Okay, that most naturally, yes. But why else? Well, like what would start the quarreling? Yeah. All right, so that's definitely in play. Here's Benjamin, who gets like 5 times as much as everybody else. And I think the other thing is that thinking back over the last 15 years or so of their lives, and thinking how Joseph had said that they would bow down before him, and they were like, "Well, no, I won't do that." And maybe the brothers would be tempted to kind of misremember and change the things that had happened. Well, I believe Joseph. I was the one who said we shouldn't kill him. I was the one. I knew. I just knew that God would use this to be a blessing. And it would be very easy for them to look at this turn of events where previously they had quarreled because they wanted to get rid of Joseph, and now they quarrel. There's an opportunity for quarreling and fighting because Joseph hasn't been gotten rid of, and Joseph has actually done very well, and God has turned it into a blessing. That's kind of what we call like hindsight bias. Like, in hindsight, I knew this was going to happen. In hindsight, of course, Ohio State would lose by 22 points. Everybody would have known that. But going forward through time, that's the only other Michigan reference I will make ever this year. But going forward through time, everybody would be like, it looks like a good game. Nobody knows. All right. Any other questions on the part that we read? Not big football fans here. That's all right. Just yeah. Still too soon. All right. Number 8. I guess the summary points at the top of page 37, the 2 bullet points. Eventually, Joseph made known who he really was, and the brothers returned to fetch their families, including Joseph's father, Jacob, and bring them all back together again. So number 8, why do you think Joseph made himself known? There's probably one big answer and maybe 2 answers. Yeah. All right, so I think that's a possibility until you get into the chapter a little bit more. Maybe Joseph does want to brag a little bit, but then we see that it's probably a little bit more sincere than that. Yeah, yeah. He wants to be reunited with his family. And he wants to use his new position of authority as a blessing for his family as well. He wants to see his father again. I mean, he loves them, and the only way that he can really provide for them is by having them come down to Egypt. And if they've got 5 more years of famine throughout the region, then that's a very precarious place, because if people start running out of food, the first place they look is, what's the neighboring country have? And so Egypt, because Egypt has food, Egypt is going to be a target, but most of all, they'll be able to provide for their army. So they won't be able to be attacked. But if you're out there living in the land of Canaan, sayonara. Yeah. 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 I'm here to watch out for you. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the main thing is that Joseph cares about his family, and we see that Joseph isn't holding a grudge. So then, number 9, why are his brothers terrified when they learned who he was? That's back in verse 3. Yeah. Yeah. They don't know what he's going to do. They don't have the benefit of knowing how he feels about them. And if he's kept himself hidden for this long, it might take a while to rebuild that trust. Is he going to take revenge on them? No. I live in Toledo. Yeah. When it comes to college football, I'm fairly ambivalent. Um, I really don't care. But the rivalry is kind of fun. So it's like, and I'm definitely tending toward the OSU side. I am. And they just got a new football coach because they were terrible. Yeah. Yeah. That is the lingering question that I'm still curious about, that I wish we had a little bit more detail. Do they confess it all to their dad and say, actually, Dad, 15 years ago we lied about Joseph being dead, and we sold him into slavery, and we all bought candy bars with the money that we got from it. And as we're wiping the chocolate off our faces, we kept up the lie for 15 years and let you believe that he was dead. Or do they just say, Joseph is alive, I don't know what happened, and then let Jacob, yeah, what do you think? Yeah, like just let Jacob draw the conclusion that that Joseph had been attacked and then lived through it, and then got picked up by these Ishmaelites and Midianites. Um, that I wish we had a little bit more detail on that, but we don't. All right, how about number 10? Looking especially at chapter 45, verses 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. What did Joseph say that God's purpose actually had been? That you intended it for harm me, but yeah, God turned it into a blessing, that God intended it for good, the saving of many lives. Here you go, Jim. Yeah. The saving of many lives. We've touched on that before. That God's promise to believers is that He will work all things out to be a blessing for them, even if it doesn't look like it's a happy occurrence. And this is definitely what God had done here, that He worked it out to be a blessing for many people. How about number 11? What task did Joseph give to his brothers? Looking at verses 9, 10, and 11. Yeah. That's all the way to the right. Should I call on the bearded catechism student? All right. Down at the end. Student with beard. All right, yeah. Yeah, he gave him a task. Bring all your families and especially your father down to Egypt. After one more year of this, Jamie, you can be a member if you want. It's really that simple. Just come to catechism class for an hour and a half for 2 years in a row. Yeah. Yeah. Pharaoh, the house of Pharaoh heard back in verse 2 that Joseph had been weeping, and this was a very emotional day. And then Joseph Pharaoh told them, well, leave all your stuff there. We can give you whatever you want because we can provide for, don't bother bringing your old couch. We'll get you a new one. Yeah, that would be fairly quick because you can make that trip by foot would take about a week from Egypt to the land of Canaan. Number 12, this is kind of a repeat. What did Pharaoh do for Joseph's family? He gave them the things for the journey and for their life in Egypt, where he would provide for them. And so yeah, if they took the King's Highway is what it was called. Then and there were Egyptian outposts along the way where they would have like a garrison of soldiers or something like that. Then it would take about a week. And that highway, that trading route was still in use. Maybe it goes this way if you're looking from your direction. It's still in use at the time of the Exodus. And so, when they're spending all that time out in the desert, it's not because they couldn't get to the promised land. They could have taken the fast highway, but God instead, as we'll see, God took them out into the desert to build them into a new nation and to use that time. How about number 13? When Jacob heard that his beloved son Joseph was alive, he was shocked. He was also hesitant to go down to Egypt to live. Why might he have thought that living in Egypt would be a bad idea? Remember the promises that God had made to him and to his father and to his grandfather. And so Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. If you think back to Genesis 12, there's a series of 7 promises. Or just a little while ago, when Jacob fled from his brother, when Jacob ran away, and he had that dream with the staircase, like resting in heaven and on earth, and he was leaving the land that God had said he would give to his family. And then God appeared to him that night and said, I'm going to give this land to you and to your descendants. And so now Joseph is living in the land with himself and his descendants. And all of a sudden one day all these carts show up from Egypt and they're like, hey, come down and live with us in Egypt. What do you think is on Jacob's mind? Keep switching those around. When everybody shows up and says, well, come down and live in Egypt. And Jacob says, time out. Yeah, God's given me this land. He promised to give me this land, and now we're living in this land with all my descendants. Why would I go there when God promised? Shouldn't I stay here? I think that's the main thing. He's wondering, is it really okay to go down to Egypt when God had promised to give them this land, and they were living in this land? So then verse 4 or number 14, how did God encourage Jacob to go and live in Egypt? That was that little bit from chapter 46. That God appeared to him and said, to you and your descendants, and I will bring them back here to live in this land. And that he would make him into a great nation down there in Egypt. This is definitely one of the longer lessons because we read like 6 chapters. All right, we are going to conclude in Genesis chapter 50. Genesis chapter 50, beginning in verse 15. Just a few short verses here. All right, beginning in verse 15, reads like this. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, and this is after all the family comes down, and Jacob lives out his years, and then they took Jacob down back to Canaan and buried him in Canaan. That was a little bit earlier in chapter 50. I was looking for how old Jacob was. Oh, anyway, we can read through that in Genesis 49 and 50. So the family all came down, and Jacob got to see his son Joseph and live there for a number of years, through the famine until after the famine, and then and Joseph was there when his father passed away, and it was this a reunion that was wonderful. Jacob also blessed each of the sons and talked a little bit with Judah that the descendant of Judah would be like a lion, so like the king of the beasts, and we take that as a messianic reference, reference to the Messiah coming from his family. Finally, verse 15, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, it may be that Joseph will hate us and will pay us back in full for all the evil that we did to him. They sent the following message to Joseph. Before he died, your father commanded us. You are to tell Joseph, please forgive the offense of your brothers and their sin, because they did evil to you. Now, please forgive the offense of the servants of the God of your father. Joseph wept when they spoke to him. His brothers also came and fell down in front of him, and they said, see now, we are your servants. Joseph said to them, do not be afraid, for am I in the place of God? You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring this to pass and to keep many people alive as it is this day. Now, therefore, do not be afraid. I will nourish you and your little ones. He comforted them and spoke to them in a kind way. All right. So there we have a little bit in verse 17. You're to tell Joseph, please forgive the offense of their brothers and their sin. Although, whether Jacob actually said that to them, or said it to them as a group, or maybe said it, once or twice just in passing, I'm not so sure. Yeah. Not offhand. How old Jacob lived to be? Not offhand. Between 140 and 100, between 120 and 160. That's my guess. Because he was 70 years old when he left, and another 60 years, when when Jacob was sold into slavery. So he was at least 130. and then you tack on another 15 years, so 145. Lives out the rest of the famine, 150, maybe a little bit after that, between 150, 160. That's what I would narrow it down to. I'd have to look at that a little bit more closely. That's what I forgot to bring. All right, number 15. After living in Egypt for some time, Jacob died. What did Joseph's brothers think might happen now that their father had gone to eternal life? Now that our father is dead, drum roll please, looking at verse 15. Yeah. Yeah. Like now Joseph doesn't have any reason to hold back. Joseph is still influential and in charge. And now he doesn't have any, yeah, he can take his revenge. So they're still worried about that, which at least, says to me they knew how severe it was to sell their brother into slavery, and it probably bothered them for a long time, because a lot of times when something bothers somebody for a long time, it takes a while for that to go away. What number 16? What did the brothers plan to do to try to save themselves from the wrath of their brother Joseph? Looking at verses 16, 17, and 18. Yeah. and whether that was something that Jacob had said to all of them or had said to them individually, or if they had even talked about it, I don't know. But now that Jacob is dead, is buried, there's nobody to speak up except for them. Well, Dad said you should forgive us, so please forgive us. Don't make us your slaves. Please, that would be nice. I think it's interesting the way Joseph reacts to that, which we get in the next one. What was Joseph's response? When his brothers text him with his group text, they didn't have text messaging. He had to use email. Yeah. 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 And like every time the angels show up, there's this terror, because like here's this person or creature that looks exceptionally powerful in comparison, like the shepherds in Luke 2. And that's what Joseph responds. Don't be afraid. That God has worked it all for good, and I will take care of you. And even before that, this is like the third or fourth time we hear about Joseph weeping. And it's not because Joseph is a weakling. I don't think that, that's not really in view. It's not a weak thing to cry about something. But Joseph sees how much he knows how much he loves his brothers, and he knows that the brothers don't trust him yet. And maybe it means that Joseph, that's why Joseph goes above and beyond, because he's trying to reestablish that the trust that they still don't have for him. And the only reason they don't trust him is because they know, maybe they know what they would do in his shoes. That if that if they had the opportunity, they would take revenge, and yet Joseph isn't. And so that blanket statement, number one, don't be afraid. Number two, that God has worked it out for good, meaning that God has turned this into a blessing. And then number three, it's not just that God has brought it all back to neutral and all the scales of karma have been balanced, but Joseph says, I'm going to take care of you. That this is a positive thing. We can talk about karma some other time. It doesn't exist. It's fake and it's false, but it's worth talking about sometime in catechism class. I'm serious. I mean, if I remember, it'll come up. It'll come up, probably in another 10 lessons. How about number 18? How can we be certain that God has forgiven us in Jesus' death and resurrection? As an application from this account, where the brothers had been told that they were forgiven multiple times, and they disbelieved it. They did not believe it. And you and I, as an application or an illustration, you and I have been forgiven not for selling somebody into slavery, but we've been forgiven for all of our sin. And how can we be sure? How can we be certain that God has forgiven us? God, before Jacob passed away, he said that you should forgive me. Yeah, you can pray. All right. I think when we're looking for certainty, though, we have to look at the words and promises of God. That our prayer is us talking to God, whereas in His Word is God talking to us, and that word that does not change. And if God has said something or promised something, He verifies that it's going to be true. I think together with that, by example, that He has given us the sacrament of Holy Communion, for instance. We talked about that this past Sunday, that in that sacrament of Holy Communion, that Jesus gives you your forgiveness again, in a way that's tangible, that you can taste, and that it's not just words that you hear and hopefully it applies to me, but God has given multiple different ways, in baptism, that He has promised to create faith and to wash your sins away. In Holy Communion, He's done the same. Even we still offer private confession absolution with pastor, that I can speak specifically to whatever sin is troubling a person's conscience, and I can say that that particular sin, even if it's something that you've been carrying for 20 years, like these brothers, that particular sin has been completely paid for and atoned for, and you are forgiven. How about this one? What makes forgiving other people difficult? Never had to forgive anybody. You ever have a brother that he hurt you in some way and you had to say, I forgive you? Yeah. So I think part of it, maybe it's anger, that we do want revenge of some sort. We want things to be evened out. Maybe it is sadness that we missed out on something, missed out on an event, couldn't go to something, or it hurt us, or it still saddens us that someone that we care about would harm us. That those emotions can sometimes get in the way, or sometimes make it very difficult. And I think we try not to ignore those emotions. We deal with them. But I think the illustration that I like to use, that I borrowed from somebody else, is that knowing, forgiveness is like the rider, and then the emotions that are attached to that are like the elephant. That the elephant will go where it wants to go, and it can take suggestions from the rider, but it might take some time to turn around. That logically we know what it means to forgive somebody, but sometimes the emotions attached to it means that it takes a little bit more time to come to peace with that. I'm sure you'll encounter that later in your life too. Finally, in the fifth petition there in the blue box at the bottom, reads like this: forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. What does this mean? We pray in this petition that our Father in heaven would not look upon our sins or because of them deny our prayers. For we are worthy of none of the things for which we ask, neither have we deserved them, but we ask that he would give them all to us by grace. For we daily sin much and surely deserve nothing but punishment. So too will we forgive from the heart and gladly do good to those who sin against us. And even though it's a fairly quick summary in like a paragraph and a sentence, um, that doesn't mean that forgiveness is something that is instantaneous or that you're instantly at peace with it. Sometimes it takes some time, but it's something that we keep working toward. And the nice thing about this is that Luther kind of refocuses our eyes first on the forgiveness that each of us has received, and that's the only way that we get past or move from holding a grudge to not. So your memory work, I've got a sheet for you that with the schedule. You've got the key questions on page 39. The reading, there it says the homework. You've got pages 273 to 278. The Bible passages, if you haven't gotten those written out yet on your cards, and start at least getting familiar with them, please do so. And then the portion of the catechism for looking at a few times during the week, maybe memorizing, is baptism part 3. And we'll have that in church on Sunday. Well, that wraps us up. Thank you very much.